March 17, 1943, North Atlantic, U-boat commander Werner Hartmann watches through his periscope as 42 men freeze to death in the water after he torpedoes their merchant ship. 8 months later, locked in a Scottish POW camp, British intelligence offers him an impossible choice: use his expertise to help protect the very convoys he once hunted, or stay silent while thousands more sailors drown in the Atlantic every month. When Hartmann agrees to cooperate, forming a secret advisory group of 12 German officers, no one knows that their insane idea will save 4,200 lives, or that the price of that choice will be far higher than anyone imagined. What happens when helping the enemy becomes the most human thing you can do? Stay tuned to find out. March 17, 1943, North Atlantic, 480 miles west of Ireland, the SS city of Benares, listed 43 degrees to port, its hull screaming as steel buckled and tore. Kapitänleutnant Werner Hartmann watched through the periscope of U-517 as the merchant vessel began its final descent into the black water. 2 torpedoes. The first had struck amidships at 0417, the second 5 minutes later when the crew tried to launch the lifeboats. Standard procedure. No survivors meant no position reports, no distress signals that could bring destroyers down on his position. He rotated the periscope slowly, counting the heads bobbing in the water. 42 men, maybe 43. The sun hadn't risen yet, and the March water temperature sat at 38 degrees Fahrenheit. They had 20 minutes before hypothermia took them, maybe 30 if they were strong. Hartmann didn't surf it. U-517 had been at sea for 62 days, had sunk 11 ships totaling 68,000 tons, and still had 4 torpedoes remaining. The convoy routes were thick with targets this time of year, merchantmen hauling steel and grain and ammunition from America to Britain, keeping the island alive while Hitler's armies squeezed from the east. His orders were clear: maximum tonnage, minimum risk. Return to Lorient with something to show for 3 months in the Atlantic. One of the men in the water was screaming. Hartmann could hear it through the hull, a thin, desperate sound that cut through the ocean and the steel plating like a blade. He stepped back from the periscope. His executive officer, Oberleutnant Klaus Reinhardt, stood at the chart table, with his hands flat on the navigation plot. Neither man spoke. The screaming stopped. Hartmann ordered the boat to periscope depth, and swept the horizon one final time. Empty, grey water meeting grey sky at a line so faint it barely existed. He gave the order to dive to 80 meters, and proceed on course 090, back toward the main shipping lanes, where the convoys ran in tight formations, destroyers prowling the flanks, submarine hunters with sonar, and depth charges waiting for the first mistake. U-517 slipped beneath the surface, its electric motors humming quietly, as the diving planes angled down, and the ballast tanks flooded with seawater. In the control room, the crew moved through their routines with mechanical precision, reading gauges and adjusting valves and marking the ship's position on the plot every 15 minutes. Hartmann went to his cabin, a space the size of a closet with a fold-down bunk and a desk bolted to the bulkhead. He pulled out his log and recorded the sinking, time, position, tonnage, torpedo expenditure. He wrote in a clear, efficient hand, the same way he'd been trained at the submarine when Kiel before the war turned serious, and the Atlantic became a graveyard for both sides. His city of Benares, 500 tons cargo unknown, sunk at 0417 hours, 2 torpedoes, no survivors observed. He closed the log and lay on the bunk, staring at the curved steel ceiling 6 inches from his face. The boat rocked gently in the deep water, a slow pendulum motion that never quite stopped. Somewhere above, 42 men were floating face down in the North Atlantic, their bodies already starting to drift apart in the current, spreading across miles of empty ocean where no one would find them until the fish in the cold finished the work. The torpedoes had started. Hartmann closed his eyes. He'd been hunting in these waters for 18 months, since the summer of 1941, when the wolf packs first began to decimate the Atlantic convoys and the tonnage numbers climbed so high that Donitz started calling it the happy time. 34 ships sunk, 90,000 tons sent to the bottom. 3 depth charge attacks survived, 2 of them close enough to crack pipes and short out electrical panels and send men sprawling across the deck plates. while the boat screamed and bucked like a living thing trying to tear itself apart. He'd won the Iron Cross First Class after sinking a 12,000-ton tanker off the coast of Newfoundland, had shaken hands with Donitz himself at the awards ceremony in Lorient, while photographers captured the moment for the propaganda reels that played in cinemas across Germany. Werner Hartmann, the U-boat ace, the hunter of the Atlantic, 29 years old, with the eyes of a man twice his age, the boat's hydrophone operator, a kid from Hamburg named Fischer, knocked on the cabin door. Contact bearing 270, single screw, diesel engine, probably a trawler, or small coastal freighter. Hartmann swung his legs off the bunk and followed Fischer back to the control room. Reinhardt was already at the periscope, tracking the contact. Hartmann took his position at the attack periscope, the smaller scope they used when close to targets, and brought the lenses to his eyes. The vessel appeared through the grey dawn light, a fishing trawler converted for coastal patrol, maybe 400 tons, British flag hanging limp from the stern mast. It was alone, no escorts, no support vessels, just one small boat chugging along the surface, like it had all the time in the world. Hartmann watched it for 3 minutes, tracking its course and speed, calculating the intercept geometry in his head the way he'd done 1,000 times before. The trawler was zigzagging, a basic evasion pattern that any competent captain would use in submarine-infested waters, but the turns were predictable, mechanical, probably following a printed diagram from some British naval manual distributed to auxiliary vessels at the start of the war. He could put a torpedo into it with his eyes closed, 4 torpedoes remaining. The trawler was maybe worth half of one, if he was being generous with the tonnage calculation. Reinhardt stood beside him, waiting. The crew waited. The boat hung motionless in the water at periscope depth, 40 meters down, with just the top of the scope breaking the surface, invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. Hartmann stepped back from the periscope. "Let it pass," he said. Reinhardt's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a momentary flicker that might have been relief, or disappointment, or just fatigue from 62 days underwater breathing recycled air, and eating canned meat and trying not to think about the depth charge. The trawler churned past, oblivious, its crew probably drinking tea, and smoking cigarettes, and counting the hours until they could return to whatever port they'd left that morning. U-5117 stayed deep and silent, letting the sound of the diesel engine fade into the background noise of the Atlantic, the endless wash of waves and current, and the distant groaning of the thermocline as temperature layers shifted in the deep water. Hartmann returned to his cabin and lay on the bunk again. Through the hull, he could hear the electric motors humming, and the soft clink of tools in the engine room where the mechanics performed their constant maintenance, checking seals and lubricating bearings and replacing worn gaskets before they failed and flooded the boat with seawater and carbon monoxide. He thought about the men from the city of Benares, their bodies drifting in the current, and wondered if any of them had families waiting in Liverpool or Glasgow or London, wives who would receive telegrams in a few weeks informing them that their husbands were missing at sea, presumed lost. He thought about his own wife, Anna, who lived in Bremen with their 3-year-old daughter, and worked in a factory, making artillery shells for the Wehrmacht. He hadn't seen them in 7 months. The last letter he'd received, forwarded through the naval postal system to Lorient and handed to him an hour before U-5117 departed on this patrol, had been 3 pages of careful handwriting describing their daughter's progress in learning to count and recite simple poems. Anna never mentioned the war directly, never asked when he'd be home, or whether he was safe, because she knew the censors would black out anything that could be considered sensitive or detrimental to morale. She signed the letter with her name, and their daughter's name, and a small drawing of a house with a tree beside it, something their daughter had added in crayon. Hartmann kept the letter in his log, folded between the pages where he recorded each sinking. He didn't read it anymore. Reading it made the cabin feel smaller and the air thinner, and the distance between himself and everything he'd left behind feel like something physical, a weight pressing down on his chest until breathing became difficult. The boat continued east, running deep during daylight hours and surfacing at night to recharge the batteries and ventilate the interior, pulling fresh air through the diesel engines while the crew took turns standing on the conning tower reeds, breathing air that didn't taste like oil and sweat and fear. On the 4th night after sinking the city of Benares,
U-517 encountered convoy HX-2, 42 merchant ships arranged in 9 columns with a destroyer escort screen that included 6 warships, 2 of them equipped with the new centimetric radar that could detect a submarine's periscope at 3 miles even in heavy seas. Hartmann attacked from the convoy's rear quarter, firing 3 torpedoes in a spread pattern at the largest target he could identify, a Liberty ship that sat low in the water with what had to be a full cargo load. All 3 torpedoes ran true, their propellers leaving phosphorescent trails in the dark water as they closed the distance at 46 knots. 2 hit. The Liberty ship, SS Jonathan Harrington, exploded with a flash of light so bright that Hartmann had to shield his eyes from the periscope. The cargo had been ammunition, 4,200 tons of artillery shells, small arms rounds and high explosives bound for British forces in North Africa. The explosion vaporized the center section of the ship and broke the hull in half, both ends lifting out of the water before sliding beneath the surface in less than 90 seconds. The shockwave from the detonation rattled U-517's hull and cracked 2 pressure gauges in the control room. Hartmann didn't wait to assess the damage. He ordered the boat to emergency deep full speed ahead on electric motors, diving planes hard down, taking the boat to 200 meters while the destroyer escort turned inward and began dropping depth charges in a pattern that covered the area where U-517 had fired. 23 depth charges in the first attack run. The boat shook with each detonation, light bulbs shattering, equipment breaking loose from its mountings, men grabbing for handholds as the deck tilted and rolled. 1 charge detonated close enough that paint flaked off the bulkheads and water began seeping through a seal in the forward torpedo room. The chief engineer, a veteran named Kessler who'd been sailing in U-boats since, sealed the leak with rubber compound and metal clamps while depth charges continued to rain down from above, each one a thunderclap of pressure that compressed the hull and made the steel groan like something alive and in pain. Hartmann stood at the chart table, his hands flat on the navigation plot, watching the compass and the depth gauge, and listening to the sound of the destroyer's propellers as they circled overhead. Reinhardt stood beside him, his face expressionless, waiting for the depth charge that would crack the pressure hull and flood the boat with seawater moving at the speed of sound, crushing everyone inside before they had time to drown. The attack lasted 47 minutes. Then the destroyers moved off, their propeller sounds fading to the east as they returned to the convoy, leaving U-517 alone in the deep water with a damaged hull seal, 2 broken pressure gauges, and 1 torpedo remained.
October 1967, 22 years after the war ended, Hartmann stood on the docks in Bremen, watching a modern cargo ship being loaded with containers, the process automated and efficient, nothing like the chaotic manual loading he remembered from before the war. The harbor had been completely rebuilt, the bombed shipyards replaced with new facilities, the destroyed city slowly rising from its ruins into something that resembled its former self, but would never quite be the same. Anna was at home preparing dinner, their rebuilt life now comfortable and stable, 2 decades of hard work having restored them to something approaching middle-class security. Hartmann had worked for the reconstructed railway system until his retirement the previous year, advancing to management positions and contributing to Germany's economic recovery. He'd never returned to the sea, never even wanted to after everything that had happened with U-517 and the Atlantic campaign. Beside him stood Reinhardt, visiting from Hamburg where he'd built a successful career in engineering. They'd remained friends through the decades, meeting occasionally to talk about their shared experiences and the complicated legacy of the advisory group. Reinhardt had never fully made peace with their wartime cooperation, still viewing it as a moral compromise that couldn't be justified even by the lives saved, but he'd come to accept it as something that had happened, part of their history that they'd carry until they died. "You ever think about those 5,000 people?" Reinhardt asked, watching the cargo ship. Hartmann nodded. "Sometimes. I wonder who they were, what lives they went on to live, whether they ever knew how close they came to dying in the Atlantic. Probably most of them have no idea that 12 German prisoners changed convoy routes and saved their lives." Reinhardt lit a cigarette, his hands steady despite his age. "Does that bother you? That they don't know?" Hartmann thought about it. No, saving them wasn't about recognition or gratitude. It was about doing something meaningful when we had the chance. Whether anyone remembers doesn't change what happened. They stood in companionable silence, 2 old men watching ships move in and out of a peaceful harbor, the war a distant memory that still shaped everything they were but no longer defined their entire existence. In 1965, the British government had declassified portions of the advisory group's final report, and several historians had written about the program as an example of humanitarian cooperation during wartime. Hartmann and the other participants had been interviewed, their testimonials included in academic books and documentary films about the Battle of the Atlantic. The coverage was generally positive, framing their cooperation as brave and morally complex rather than traitorous. Public opinion in Germany had shifted too. The immediate post-war anger and suspicion had given way to more nuanced understanding of wartime moral dilemmas. People recognized that survival under extreme circumstances required difficult choices, and that judging those choices from the comfort of peacetime was neither fair nor productive. The advisory group members were increasingly seen as men who'd tried to do the right thing in an impossible situation, and their work saving 5,000 lives was acknowledged as meaningful even if the circumstances remained complicated. Hartmann had received letters over the years from some of the people who'd been on convoys that the advisory group had helped protect. The British Admiralty had facilitated these contacts, providing addresses for advisory group members to individuals who wanted to express gratitude for being alive. The letters were emotional and heartfelt, thanking Hartmann for helping save their lives or their husbands' lives or their father's life. Reading those letters had helped Hartmann make peace with his choices, understanding that the abstract number of 5,000 lives represented actual people with families and futures who existed because of what the advisory group had done. One letter in particular had stayed with him. It came from a British merchant sailor named Thomas Wright, who'd been on 3 convoys that had implemented advisory group recommendations. Wright's letter explained that he'd lost his brother in a U-boat attack in 1942 before the advisory group existed, and had expected to suffer the same fate when he enlisted for convoy duty, but he'd survived multiple Atlantic crossings without seeing combat, and he'd later learned through the declassified reports that his convoys had been routed using information provided by German prisoners. Wright's letter acknowledged the complexity of the situation. German submariners helped protect ships that would otherwise have been legitimate military targets, but expressed profound gratitude for being alive to marry and have children and build a life that wouldn't have existed if different choices had been made in a Scottish prisoner of war camp. Hartmann had written back and they'd corresponded occasionally over the years, an unlikely friendship between men who might have killed each other under different circumstances, but instead shared a connection forged by the advisory group's work. That friendship had helped Hartmann understand that the binary categories of enemy and ally, traitor and patriot, collaboration and humanitarian cooperation were insufficient for capturing the moral reality of what they'd experienced. The world was more complicated than those categories allowed, and navigating that complexity required accepting ambiguity and uncertainty rather than demanding clear answers to questions that didn't have them. Reinhardt stubbed out his cigarette and turned away from the harbor. "I should get back to Hamburg. Long drive ahead." Hartmann nodded. "Thanks for visiting. It's good to see you." They shook hands and Reinhardt walked toward the parking area where his car was waiting. Hartmann remained at the harbor for another hour, watching ships and thinking about U-5 and the advisory group and the long arc of his life from submarine commander to prisoner to collaborator to retired railway administrator. The trajectory seemed impossible to predict or explain, a series of decisions and circumstances that had accumulated into something he could barely recognize as his own life when he looked back across the decades. But he'd survived. Anna had survived. They'd rebuilt. The 5,000 people saved by the advisory group had lived their lives and raised families and contributed to the world in ways that were impossible to quantify but undeniably real. The mathematics of it all still didn't add up to anything coherent, but maybe that was the point. Maybe some things couldn't be added up, couldn't be balanced against each other in ledgers that produced clear moral judgment. Maybe all you could do was make the best decisions possible with the information available and accept that those decisions would be evaluated differently by different people at different times, and that was okay because moral certainty was a luxury that war and extreme circumstances didn't permit. Hartmann turned away from the harbor and walked back toward the city center, toward the apartment where Anna was waiting, toward the remainder of his life that would be defined by the normal rhythms of retirement and family and the slow passage of time. The war was over. The consequences had played out. What remained was the task of living with what he'd done, and who he'd become, carrying those experiences without letting them consume everything else. It wasn't redemption or resolution, just continuation, and maybe that was enough. The seal in the forward torpedo room failed completely at 07:30 the following morning. Kessler had been monitoring it through the night, checking the rubber compound every 15 minutes, tightening the clamps when they showed signs of loosening under the constant pressure, cycling as the boat rose and dove to avoid detection. The seal held until it didn't. One moment it was weeping seawater at a rate of maybe 2 liters per hour, manageable with the bilge pumps running at minimum capacity, and the next moment it tore completely, and seawater began flooding into the torpedo room at a rate that would fill the compartment in less than 20 minutes. Hartmann was in his cabin when the alarm sounded, a piercing bell that echoed through every compartment of the boat and brought the entire crew to emergency stations. He reached the control room in 8 seconds, pulling on his jacket as he moved, and found Reinhardt already directing the damage control response. Kessler and 2 mechanics were in the forward torpedo room, working in waist-deep water that was rising visibly, trying to get emergency patches over the failed seal while the boat's trim started to shift forward as the added weight pulled the bow down. They couldn't surf. British patrol aircraft had been active in the area since the convoy attack, Sunderland flying boats equipped with depth charges and machine guns, hunting for the submarine that had sunk the Jonathan Harrington. Surfacing in daylight meant exposure, and exposure meant death from above before they could repair the damage and dive again. But staying submerged with a major leak meant slow flooding and eventual loss of trim control, the bow sinking lower and lower, until the boat went into an uncontrolled dive toward the bottom, 3,000 meters down, where the pressure hull would implode at around 400 meters depth. Hartmann made the calculation in 5 seconds. Surface, he ordered. Emergency blow all tanks, take her up fast. The boat lurched upward as compressed air blasted into the ballast tanks, driving out the seawater and giving U-517 positive buoyancy. They broke the surface at a steep angle, the bow rising out of the water first, then slamming back down as gravity and momentum fought for control. Hartmann climbed the ladder to the conning tower bridge and pushed open the hatch, pulling himself through into cold grey morning air that tasted like salt and diesel exhaust. The ocean was empty in every direction except one. 3 miles to the southeast, a British destroyer was turning toward them, already at flank speed, its bow wave white against the dark water. Hartmann recognized the silhouette immediate. Town-class destroyer, probably HMS Brighton or one of her sisters, 1010's displacement, 4 4-inch guns, 8 torpedo tubes, top speed 36 knots. U-517 could make 17 knots on the surface with its diesel engines running at maximum power, but the damage to the forward torpedo room meant the bow was sitting lower in the water than normal, creating additional drag that would slow them down to maybe 15 knots. The destroyer would close the distance in 12 minutes. Hartmann dropped back into the control room and told Reinhardt to get the damage control team working faster. They had maybe 10 minutes before the destroyer came into gun range and started putting 4-inch shells into the pressure hull. Then he climbed back up to the bridge and watched the destroyer grow larger, its shape resolving into individual details as the range decreased. He could see the gun crews now, men in dark uniforms moving around the forward turrets, loading shells and training the barrels on U-517. The boat shuddered as the diesel engines engaged at full power, black smoke pouring from the exhausts as the mechanics pushed every component to its maximum rating, 15 knots, 14.8. The bow was still sitting too low, the added weight from the flooded torpedo room dragging against the water like an anchor. Kessler appeared on the bridge, water dripping from his uniform, his face pale. The seal is beyond field repair, he said. We can't patch it properly without dry dock equipment. We'd need to weld new mounting brackets and replace the entire fitting assembly. Hartmann nodded slowly. How long to get the water out of the torpedo room? 3 hours minimum if we stay surfaced and run the pumps continuously. The destroyer was 2 miles away now, close enough that Hartmann could see the bow wave curling away from its stem, white water spreading in a V-shape that marked the destroyer's passage like a scar across the ocean. He looked at Reinhardt, who had joined them on the bridge. Reinhardt's expression was blank, carefully controlled, the face of a man who knew what was about to happen, and had already accepted it. Hartmann felt something cold settle into his chest, a weight that had nothing to do with the Atlantic air or the water temperature. He'd known this moment would come eventually, had known it since the first patrol when he'd looked through the periscope at a sinking freighter and watched men die in the water while he remained safe inside his steel tube. Every U-boat commander knew,
The statistics were simple and brutal. 75% of U-boats never returned from patrol. The average life expectancy of a submarine crew member was 6 months. Hartmann had beaten those odds for 18 months, had sent 34 ships to the bottom and brought his crew home alive after every patrol, but the odds always caught up eventually. The destroyer fired a warning shot, a single 4-inch shell that landed 50 meters off U-5 port side, and threw up a column of water that hung in the air for a moment before collapsing back into the ocean. The message was clear: stop engines and surrender, or the next salvo would be aimed directly at the conning tower. Hartmann looked at his crew, the men who had followed him into the Atlantic and trusted him to bring them home. Fischer, the hydrophone operator from Hamburg who couldn't have been more than 20 years old. Kessler, the chief engineer, who'd kept the boat running through depth charge attacks and mechanical failures and the constant grinding stress of life underwater. Reinhardt, his executive officer, who'd stood beside him through 11 merchant ship sinkings and never once questioned an order. He thought about Anna and their daughter in Bremen waiting for him to come home. He thought about the 42 men from the city of Banneres floating face down in the North Atlantic. He thought about the 4,200 tons of ammunition that had vaporized when the Jonathan Harrington exploded, and the destroyer bearing down on them with its guns trained and ready. Stop engines, he said quietly, signal surrender. The destroyer came alongside 20 minutes later. British sailors with rifles lined the rail, their weapons pointed down at U-5's deck where Hartmann had assembled his crew, all 49 men standing in formation with their hands visible and empty. A launch was lowered from the destroyer, and a boarding party crossed over led by a Royal Navy lieutenant commander, who climbed onto U-5's deck and accepted Hartmann's surrender with clipped efficient courtesy. The U-boat crew was transferred to the destroyer in groups of 6, climbing up rope ladders while British sailors kept rifles trained on them throughout the process. Hartmann went last, taking a final look at U-5 before he climbed. The boat was already settling lower in the water as the forward torpedo room continued to flood. The British would probably try to tow it back to port for intelligence purposes, strip out the Enigma machine and code books and navigation equipment, but Hartmann had already made sure all sensitive material went over the side, weighted with wrenches and sealed in a weighted bag that sank to the bottom where no one would ever find it. He climbed the rope ladder with Reinhardt beside him. At the top, British sailors grabbed their arms and pulled them aboard the destroyer, then escorted them below decks to a cargo hold that had been converted into a temporary holding cell. The rest of U-5's crew was already there, sitting on the deck plates in silence, their faces blank with shock and exhaustion. Hartmann sat down with his back against the bulkhead and closed his eyes. Through the destroyer's hull, he could hear the engines running at idle speed and the sounds of the boarding party working on U-5, probably trying to get pumps running to keep the submarine afloat long enough to tow it back to Britain. He wondered if they'd succeed. He wondered if it mattered. The destroyer got underway an hour later, leaving U-5 behind to sink slowly in the North Atlantic. Hartmann didn't see it happen, but he heard about it later from one of the British guards who brought food and water to the holding cell. The submarine had gone down by the bow at 11:47, the stern rising out of the water before sliding beneath the surface, taking with it 18 months of his life and everything he'd accomplished as a U-boat commander. HMS Brighton arrived at Scapa Flow 3 days later. The German prisoners were transferred to a Royal Navy transport that took them south to Liverpool, then by train to a processing centre in the Midlands where British intelligence officers conducted initial interrogations, taking down names and ranks and service records, checking them against captured documents and prisoner reports from other U-boats. Hartmann told them nothing beyond his name, rank and serial number. Reinhardt told them nothing. The crew told them nothing. The interrogators were professional and persistent, asking the same questions multiple times in different ways, looking for inconsistencies or contradictions. But the Germans had been trained for this scenario and knew that silence was the only defense they had. After a week of interrogation, Hartmann and his crew were loaded onto trucks and transported to a prisoner of war camp in the Scottish Highlands, a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, holding approximately 2,000 German prisoners from various branches of the armed forces. The commandant was a British Army colonel named Morrison, a career officer who'd served in France during the First World War, and carried himself with the rigid formality of a man who believed in rules and regulations above all else. Morrison addressed the new arrivals in the camp's main assembly area, standing on a wooden platform while guards with rifles watched from the perimeter. He spoke in German, his accent thick but comprehensible, explaining the camp rules and what would be expected of them as prisoners of war. Work details would be assigned, food would be provided, medical care would be available, attempts to escape would be punished, cooperation would be rewarded with better conditions, resistance would result in isolation and reduced ration. Hartmann listened without expression, his hands behind his back, standing at parade rest beside Reinhardt. Around them the other prisoners from U-5 stood in loose formation, their faces exhausted and blank. They'd been at sea for 62 days before the capture, living in a steel tube 44 meters long and 6 meters wide, breathing recycled air and eating canned meat and sleeping in shifts. Because there weren't enough bunks for everyone, the camp looked like paradise by comparison. Wooden barracks with real beds, fresh air, open sky, ground that didn't move under their feet. Morrison finished his speech and dismissed them to their assigned barracks. Hartmann's crew was split up, distributed across different housing units to prevent them from forming a cohesive group that might organize resistance or escape attempt. Hartmann and Reinhardt were assigned to Barracks 7, a long wooden structure that held 60 prisoners in double-bunked beds, arranged in 2 rows. They were given British Army blankets, mess kits, and a small footlocker for personal belongings. That night, lying on a real bed for the first time in 2 months, Hartmann stared at the ceiling and thought about U-5 at the bottom of the Atlantic, its pressure hull slowly corroding in the cold dark water, becoming a tomb and a monument to 18 months of hunting.
The days in the camp followed a pattern that became routine within a week. Morning roll call at 060, standing in formation outside the barracks while British guards counted heads and checked names against their rosters. Breakfast in the mess hall at 070, porridge and bread and weak tea that tasted like it had been brewed from the same leaves for a month. Work details from 080 to 170, assigned by a rotation system that Colonel Morrison had implemented to prevent prisoners from becoming too comfortable or familiar with any single task. Dinner at 180, more porridge or occasionally stew made from vegetables and mystery meat that no one wanted to identify too carefully. Evening free time until lights out at 22:00, spent playing cards or reading from the camp's small library or simply sitting on bunks and staring at the walls. Hartmann was assigned to the forestry detail on his 3rd day in camp, a work party of 20 prisoners who were trucked 5 miles into the Highland woods to cut timber for the British war effort. The work was hard and physical, swinging axes and operating hand saws and hauling logs to collection points where they'd be loaded onto trucks and transported to sawmills. The guards who supervised them were older men, veterans of the First World War who'd been called back to service and assigned to guard duty because they were too old for frontline combat. They carried rifles but rarely pointed them at the prisoners, mostly just sat on stumps and smoked cigarettes and watched with bored expressions while the Germans worked. Reinhardt was on the same detail, assigned to a different section of the forest but close enough that they could see each other occasionally through the trees. On the 4th day, during the midday meal break when the prisoners sat on fallen logs and ate sandwiches provided by the camp kitchen, Reinhardt moved over to where Hartmann was sitting and kept his voice low enough that the guards couldn't hear. "We should start planning an escape," he said. Hartmann took a bite of his sandwich, dry bread with a thin layer of some kind of paste that might have been meat or might have been vegetable matter ground into submission. He chewed slowly, looking at the trees and the hills rolling away into the distance and the guards sitting 30 meters away with their rifles across their laps. "Where would we go?" Reinhardt glanced around, making sure no other prisoners were close enough to overhear. "South to the coast, steal a boat, cross to Neutral Island, or north to find a fishing village and stow away on a vessel heading to Norway." Hartmann finished his sandwich and brushed crumbs off his pants. "The coast is 100 miles away. We don't speak English well enough to pass as local. We have no money, no maps, no supplies and no training for overland navigation in unfamiliar territory. Even if we made it to the coast, the entire British Home Guard would be looking for escaped German prisoners. The odds of reaching Ireland or Norway are approximately 0. Reinhardt's jaw tightened. "So we just sit here for the rest of the war?" Hartmann looked at him directly. "We sit here and we survive and we wait for Germany to win, or we wait for the war to end, or we wait for whatever comes next. But we don't throw our lives away on an escape attempt that has no realistic chance of success." Reinhardt stood up and walked away without responding. Hartmann watched him go, understanding the frustration but unable to offer any alternative that made sense. They were prisoners in the middle of Scotland, hundreds of miles from Germany, surrounded by an enemy nation, that had every resource and motivation to keep them locked up until the war ended. Escape was a fantasy, a story prisoners told themselves to maintain some sense of agency and control. The reality was simpler and more brutal. They were here until someone else decided they could leave. The forestry detail continued for 3 weeks before Hartmann was rotated to a different assignment, this time working in the camp's vegetable garden, a 2-acre plot where prisoners grew potatoes and carrots and cabbage to supplement the camp's food supply. The work was easier than logging, mostly weeding and watering and occasional harvesting, but it was also more tedious, hours spent kneeling in dirt under grey Scottish sky while guards watched from the fence line. One of the other prisoners on the garden detail was a Luftwaffe pilot named Dieter Wolf, shot down over the English Channel in late 1942, and captured after spending 6 hours in a life raft before a British patrol boat picked him up. Wolf was thin and talkative, the kind of man who needed conversation to fill the silence, and he spent most of his time in the garden telling stories about his life before the war, his training as a pilot, the missions he'd flown over Britain before his plane took a hit from anti-aircraft fire and he'd been forced to bail out over the Channel. Hartmann listened without contributing much to the conversation, pulling weeds and thinking about U-5 and 17 at the bottom of the Atlantic. Wolf talked about escape plans constantly, elaborate schemes involving stolen uniforms and forged documents, and carefully timed diversions, but Hartmann could tell these were fantasies, stories Wolf told himself to maintain hope. One afternoon, while they were harvesting potatoes and loading them into wooden crates, Wolf asked Hartmann why he never talked about escape. Hartmann dropped a potato into a crate and reached for another plant. "Because I'm not interested in getting shot trying to climb a fence," he said. Wolf laughed, a sharp barking sound that had no humor in it. "You'd rather just sit here until we're old men." Hartmann pulled another potato from the soil and examined it for damage. "I'd rather survive the war and go home to my family. Everything else is second." Wolf was quiet for a moment, then went back to work. They didn't discuss escape again. The camp had its own rhythm, a culture that developed among the prisoners as weeks turned into months. Card games with complicated betting systems using cigarettes and food rations as currency. Language classes where prisoners who spoke English taught others basic phrases and grammar. Theater performances on Sunday afternoons. Prisoners performing scenes from German plays using improvised costumes and stage props built from scrap materials. Hartmann avoided most of the social activities, preferring to spend his free time alone reading from the camp library or writing letters to Anna that would be censored by British intelligence before being forwarded through the Red Cross postal system to Germany. He wrote carefully, describing his daily routine in general terms, mentioning the food and the work details and the weather, never revealing anything about the camp's location or security or the conditions of his imprisonment. Anna's replies came irregularly, sometimes 2 or 3 letters arriving in the same week, sometimes months of silence followed by a single page describing their daughter's progress in school or some small incident from their daily life in Bremen. The letters were lifelines, thin threads connecting him to a world that felt increasingly distant and unreal. One letter arrived in July 1943, 4 months after his capture, that mentioned air raids over Bremen, British bombers targeting the shipyards and industrial facilities, their daughter being evacuated to the countryside to stay with Anna's sister. The letter was clinical and factual, no emotion or commentary, just information delivered in Anna's careful handwriting. Hartmann read it 3 times, then folded it and put it in his footlocker with the other. That night he lay awake on his bunk, staring at the ceiling and thinking about bombers over Bremen, the city burning while his wife and daughter huddled in a shelter or fled to the countryside. He thought about U-5 and 17 and the city of Benares and the Jonathan Harrington, and all the other ships he'd sunk, the crews who'd died in the water while he watched through a periscope. He thought about the arithmetic of the war, tonnage sunk versus tonnage built, submarines lost versus submarines commissioned, men killed versus men trained to replace them. The numbers were brutal and impersonal, a calculus that reduced human lives to statistics in a ledger that someone somewhere was keeping, adding and subtracting, and calculating the final sum. In August, a new group of prisoners arrived at the camp, U-boat crews from 3 submarines that had been sunk in the North Atlantic during a single week when Allied convoy escorts had decimated an entire wolf pack. Hartmann recognized some of the men, officers he'd met during training or encountered at Lorient between patrols. They brought news from the front, more U-boats lost, heavier escort presence,
New Allied technology including radar that could detect submarines on the surface at night and depth charges that could track targets through evasive maneuvers. The happy time was over. The Atlantic was becoming a killing ground for submarines, and the odds were shifting against Germany. One of the new arrivals was Kapitänleutnant Friedrich Müller, commander of U-60, sunk by a British destroyer after a 9-hour chase that ended with Müller surfacing and surrendering rather than letting his crew die in a damaged boat at the bottom of the ocean. Müller had known Hartmann at the submarine school in Kiel, had trained alongside him and competed for the same command positions before the war sent them in different directions. They sat together in the mess hall one evening, eating stew and talking quietly about the men they'd served with, who was still alive, who was missing, who had been confirmed killed in action. Müller spoke with a bitter edge in his voice, describing the final hours of U-60-3, the constant depth charge attacks, the hull breaches that couldn't be repaired, the slow realization that surrender was the only option that wouldn't end with everyone dead. Hartmann listened without interrupting, recognizing his own story in Müller's words. The question Müller finally asked was the one Hartmann had been expecting. Was it worth it? 18 months hunting in the Atlantic, 34 ships sunk, 90,000 tons sent to the bottom, and now they were sitting in a prisoner of war camp in Scotland eating British stew while the war continued without them. Had any of it mattered? Hartmann didn't have an answer. He'd followed his orders, executed his missions, brought his crew home alive until the day he couldn't anymore. Whether it mattered depended on who won the war, and from their position in the camp, surrounded by barbed wire and British guards, the outcome was looking increasingly uncertain. September brought cold rain and early darkness, the Scottish Highlands settling into autumn with grey skies and wind that cut through the prisoners' thin uniforms. The work details continued, forestry and gardening and maintenance tasks around the camp, repairs to barracks and fence lines and the small infrastructure that kept 2,000 prisoners housed and fed. Hartmann was assigned to a construction detail, building additional barracks to house the constant influx of new prisoners, as more U-boats and aircraft were shot down and captured. The work was physical and exhausting, digging foundations and hauling lumber and hammering nails until his hands were covered in blisters that broke and reformed into calluses. Reinhardt was on the same detail, working in silence alongside the other prisoners, his face set in an expression of controlled anger that never quite faded. One afternoon, while they were framing walls for a new barracks, a British supply truck arrived at the camp carrying materials for the construction project. The driver was a young private who couldn't have been more than 19, and he stayed in the cab while prisoners unloaded lumber under guard supervision. Hartmann noticed something odd about the delivery. Along with the construction materials, there were several crates marked with Red Cross symbols, care packages that had arrived from neutral countries for distribution to prisoners. The guards directed prisoners to carry the Red Cross crates to the camp administration building while continuing with the lumber delivery. Hartmann worked mechanically, his mind elsewhere, thinking about the crates and what they might contain: letters from home, food packages, medical supply, small reminders that somewhere beyond the barbed wire and guard towers, people remembered they existed. That evening, during free time after dinner, the Red Cross packages were distributed in the main assembly area. Each prisoner received one package, brown paper wrapped with string, addressed with their name and rank but no other identifying information. Hartmann opened his in his barracks, sitting on his bunk while other prisoners around him did the same. Inside was a letter from Anna, 3 pages of careful handwriting that had been censored in several places, black ink blacking out words and sentences that someone had deemed sensitive. There was also a small package of cookies that Anna had baked, now crushed into crumbs during transport, and a photograph of their daughter standing in front of their house in Bremen, smiling at the camera with gap-toothed innocence. Hartmann held the photograph for a long time, studying every detail, memorizing it. His daughter looked older than he remembered, taller, her face losing the baby roundness, and starting to show the features she'd carry into adulthood. He realized he was missing her childhood, these years when she was growing and changing, and the war might take more years beyond that. By the time he saw her again, she might be a teenager, almost an adult herself, and he'd have missed all the moments in between. He put the photograph in his footlocker and lay down on his bunk, staring at the ceiling until lights out.
October 1943. Colonel Morrison called a special assembly for all U-boat personnel in the camp, approximately 340 men from various submarines that had been sunk or captured over the past 18 months. They gathered in the mess hall after evening meal, guards posted at the exits, Morrison standing at the front with a British naval intelligence officer named Commander Blackwood. Hartmann sat in the third row with Reinhardt beside him, watching Morrison and Blackwood with the careful attention of men who'd learned that any deviation from routine meant something significant was about to happen. Morrison spoke first, his German formal and precise. "Gentlemen, you are being given an opportunity to contribute to the war effort in a way that may save lives on both sides. Commander Blackwood will explain the details. What I ask is that you listen with open minds and consider what is being proposed." Blackwood stepped forward, a tall man in his 50s with grey hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent years at sea. He spoke in English, with Morrison translating sentence by sentence. "The Atlantic U-boat campaign is killing thousands of men every month," Blackwood said. "German submariners and Allied merchant sailors are dying in equal measure, drowning in cold water or burning in fuel oil, or being crushed by depth charges and torpedo explosions. The mathematics of this war at sea are brutal. For every merchant ship we lose, approximately 30 men die. For every U-boat sunk, approximately 50 men die. The casualty rate on both sides is unsustainable." He paused, letting Morrison translate, then continued. "British naval intelligence has been analyzing U-boat tactics and patrol patterns for 2 years. We understand how your wolf packs operate, how you coordinate attacks on convoys, how you position yourselves along the main shipping routes. We also understand that many of you are following orders from commanders who have incomplete or outdated information about Allied capabilities and defense." Hartmann felt something cold settle in his chest. This was heading somewhere specific, and he didn't like the direction. Blackwood pulled out a map and pinned it to a board behind him, showing the North Atlantic with marked convoy routes and approximate U-boat patrol areas. "What I'm proposing is this," Blackwood said. "Some of you have information that could help us develop better defensive tactics, not to destroy U-boats but to avoid them, routes that keep convoys away from patrol areas, timing adjustments that reduce the probability of contact, communication protocols that allow merchant ships to call for escort support more effectively. The goal is not to win the war faster, but to reduce casualties on both sides while the war continues." Several prisoners stood up immediately, voices raised in German, angry accusations of collaboration and treason. Hartmann remained seated, his mind working through what Blackwood was actually proposing. This wasn't about giving up German military secrets or betraying their country. Blackwood was offering a way to save lives, both Allied and German, by making the Atlantic less lethal for everyone involved. Morrison raised his hands, calling for order. "Sit down, everyone sit down and let Commander Blackwood finish." The prisoners settled slowly, muttering to each other but returning to their seats. Blackwood waited until the room was quiet again. "I'm not asking anyone to betray Germany," he said. "I'm not asking for information about submarine technology or weapons systems or strategic planning. What I'm asking for is help in reducing unnecessary deaths. If you know that U-boats patrol certain areas at certain times, tell us so we can route convoys around those areas. If you know that specific weather conditions or sea states make submarine attacks more likely, tell us so we can adjust convoy schedules. If you know that certain defensive formations or escort tactics are more effective at deterring attacks, tell us so we can implement them. This is about saving sailors' lives, not about military advantage." Hartmann stood up. The room went quiet, all eyes turning toward him. "Commander Blackwood," he said in English, his accent thick but comprehensible, "what you are describing sounds noble, but it is still collaboration with the enemy. How can we trust that information we provide will only be used for defensive purposes and not to hunt and destroy more U-boats?" Blackwood met his gaze directly. "You can't," he said. "I won't lie to you about that. Any information you provide might be used in ways that harm German interests. But I can tell you that our goal is exactly what I've described, reducing casualties, not increasing them. The mathematics of the Atlantic War are simple. Right now, both sides are losing more men than we can replace. That benefits no one. If we can reduce those losses, even marginally, we save lives that might otherwise be wasted." Hartmann remained standing. "And what do we receive in return for this cooperation?" Blackwood glanced at Morrison, then back at Hartmann. "Better conditions in the camp. Access to more Red Cross packages, regular correspondence with your families, and perhaps most importantly, the knowledge that you're doing something meaningful rather than just sitting behind barbed wire waiting for the war to end."
Hartmann sat down slowly. Around him, the other prisoners were silent, processing what they'd heard. Reinhardt leaned close and whispered in German, "This is insane. If anyone finds out we cooperated, we'll be treated as traitors when we return to Germany." Hartmann kept his eyes forward. "If we return to Germany," he whispered. The meeting lasted another hour, Blackwood answering questions and Morrison maintaining order as tensions rose and fell. By the end, maybe 40 prisoners had expressed willingness to at least consider the proposal, while the rest remained hostile or neutral. Hartmann didn't commit either way. He needed time to think, to work through the implications and the risks. That night, lying on his bunk, he thought about U-5117 and the men who'd died when it sank. He thought about the city of Benares and the 42 sailors freezing in the North Atlantic. He thought about the Jonathan Harrington exploding and taking 4,200 tons of ammunition to the bottom. He thought about Anna and their daughter in Bremen, about the bombers overhead and the possibility that they might not survive the war even if he did. The mathematics were brutal, but every ship sunk meant men dead. Every U-boat destroyed meant men dead. If there was a way to reduce those deaths without betraying Germany's strategic interests, wasn't that worth considering? Or was this exactly the kind of rationalization that led to collaboration and betrayal, the slippery slope that started with small compromises and ended with complete surrender of principles? He didn't have an answer. Over the next week, Blackwood conducted individual interviews with prisoners who'd expressed interest in the proposal. Hartmann was called to Morrison's office on the 7th day, where he found Blackwood waiting with a stenographer and a pot of tea. Blackwood poured tea for both of them, and gestured for Hartmann to sit. "Kapitänleutnant Hartmann," he said, "your record indicates you commanded U-517 for 18 months, and sank 34 merchant vessels totaling approximately 90,000. You're one of the more experienced U-boat commanders in this camp, which means you have knowledge that could be genuinely useful." Hartmann sipped his tea, waiting. "What specifically do you want to know?" Blackwood pulled out a chart of the North Atlantic. "I want to know about patrol patterns. How do U-boats position themselves relative to convoy routes? How do you coordinate with other submarines in a wolf pack? What factors determine when and where you attack?" Hartmann studied the chart, recognizing the convoy routes he'd hunted along for 18 months. The routes shifted constantly based on intelligence and weather patterns, but the general corridors remained consistent. Great Circle routes from New York and Halifax to Liverpool and Glasgow, southern routes to Gibraltar and the Mediterranean, northern routes to Murmansk. He thought about what he could tell Blackwood that would save lives without compromising German strategic interests. Wolf packs typically position themselves in patrol lines perpendicular to expected convoy routes, he said slowly. Spacing between boats varies from 10 to 30 kilometers depending on visibility conditions and radio communication capabilities. When one boat makes contact with a convoy, it transmits position reports that allow other boats to converge on the target. Coordination is handled by the pack commander, usually the most senior officer, who directs individual boats to attack positions based on convoy formation and escort deployment. Blackwood listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions, while the stenographer took note. "What about timing? When are attacks most likely to occur?" "Night surface attacks were standard procedure until recently," Hartmann said. "Surface approach under cover of darkness, attack from close range, then dive and evade before escorts can respond. But Allied radar has made night surface approaches more dangerous, so many boats are shifting to submerged attacks during daylight hours, using periscope observations to set up torpedo shots. This reduces the number of torpedoes we can fire in a single attack run, but increases survivability." Blackwood marked notes on his chart. "What about specific areas where U-boats concentrate? Are there particular locations where submarine presence is consistently higher?" Hartmann hesitated. This was the line he'd been thinking about for a week, the boundary between useful defensive information and strategic intelligence that could harm German operations. Blackwood noticed the hesitation. "I know what you're thinking," he said quietly. "If you tell me where U-boats patrol most heavily, I'll route convoys through those areas with heavy escort presence and try to destroy as many submarines as possible. But consider this. If I route convoys away from those areas entirely, I reduce the chance of contact, which means fewer ships sunk and fewer U-boats depth charged. The outcome is fewer deaths on both sides." Hartmann set down his teacup. "The Central Atlantic Gap," he he said finally, approximately 1,000 miles west of Ireland, where Allied air cover from both Britain and North America can't reach. U-boats concentrate there because convoys are most vulnerable in that area, with only surface escorts and no air support. If you route convoys further north or south, even if it adds distance to the voyage, you reduce time spent in the gap and decrease the probability of submarine contact. Blackwood marked the area on his chart, then looked up at Hartmann. That's useful information. It confirms intelligence we've gathered from other sources, and gives us specific geographic parameters to work with. Thank you. Hartmann felt something uncomfortable in his chest, a sensation he couldn't quite identify. Was it guilt, relief? He'd just given the British information that might save Allied ships and sailors, but might also result in German U-boats finding fewer targets and returning to port with empty torpedo tubes, which would affect crew morale and operational effectiveness. The interview lasted 2 hours, covering tactics and procedures, and the operational realities of U-boat warfare. Blackwood asked good questions, specific and focused, avoiding areas that Hartmann clearly marked as beyond the boundaries of what he was willing to discuss. When they finished, Blackwood thanked him and said that his cooperation would be noted in his camp record. Hartmann returned to his barracks and lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling. Reinhardt was on work detail and wouldn't return until evening, which gave Hartmann time to think through what he'd done. He'd crossed a line, not a legal line or even necessarily a moral line, but a psychological one. He was no longer simply a prisoner waiting for the war to end. He was an active participant in something that might affect outcomes, might save lives, might change the mathematics of the Atlantic War in ways that were impossible to predict. That evening, when Reinhardt returned from work detail, Hartmann told him about the interview. Reinhardt listened without interrupting, his face expressionless, then asked a single question. Do you think we did the right thing by surrendering instead of scuttling the boat? Hartmann thought about it for a long moment. I think we kept 49 men alive who would otherwise be dead. Everything after that is just trying to figure out what to do with the life we've been given. Reinhardt nodded slowly and lay down on his own bunk. Neither man spoke for the rest of the evening.
November 1943. Blackwood returned to the camp with a proposal that went beyond simple intelligence gathering. He wanted to create a formal advisory group, U-boat commanders, and experienced crew members who would work with British naval intelligence to develop comprehensive defensive strategies for protecting Atlantic convoys. The group would meet twice weekly, analyzing recent convoy operations, discussing U-boat tactics, and recommending routing changes and escort deployments that could reduce casualties on both sides. Morrison called another assembly, this time limited to the 40 prisoners who'd participated in initial interviews with Blackwood. Hartmann attended, sitting in the front row with Reinhardt beside him. Around them sat other U-boat commanders and officers, men who'd spent months or years hunting Allied shipping, and now found themselves being asked to help protect it. Blackwood stood at the front of the room with detailed charts and recent operational reports spread across a table. Gentlemen, he said, Morrison translating, the information you've provided individually has been useful, but what I'm proposing now is something more systematic. I want to create a working group that meets regularly to analyze convoy operations and recommend defensive improvements. This isn't about betraying Germany. This is about applying your expertise to save lives. One of the other prisoners, a commander named Ernst Weber who'd sunk 22 ships before being captured, stood up and challenged Blackwood directly. How can you say this isn't betrayal? If we help you protect convoys, we're actively working against German military objectives. That makes us traitors, regardless of how you frame it. Blackwood nodded, acknowledging the point. You're right that this creates moral complications, but consider the reality of the situation. Germany has lost the Battle of the Atlantic. Allied ship production now exceeds tonnage sunk. New anti-submarine technologies are making U-boat operations increasingly lethal for submarine crews. The mathematics have shifted decisively against Germany, which means the U-boat campaign will fail regardless of what you do or don't do in this camp. What I'm offering is a way to reduce deaths during that failure, to save both Allied and German lives, while the inevitable conclusion plays out. Weber remained standing, and if Germany wins the war anyway, if we help you now and then return to a victorious Germany, what happens to us then? We'll be treated as collaborators and traitors. Blackwood didn't have an answer for that. and his silence was more honest than any reassurance he might have offered. Hartmann stood up. Commander Weber raises a valid concern, but I think we need to consider what's actually at stake here. Right now, thousands of men are dying every month in the Atlantic, German submariners and Allied merchant sailors. If we have knowledge that could reduce those deaths without compromising Germany's strategic position, do we have a moral obligation to provide it? Or do we sit in this camp doing nothing while men die from circumstances we might be able to affect? The room was quiet. Several prisoners looked uncomfortable, caught between competing loyalties, and trying to find a position that made sense ethically and practically. Others looked angry, viewing any cooperation as betrayal regardless of the circumstances or potential outcomes. Weber sat down slowly. "I'm not convinced," he said, "but I'm willing to listen." Blackwood spent the next hour explaining the structure of the proposed advisory group. Meetings twice weekly, in a dedicated room in the administration building. British naval intelligence officers would present recent convoy operations, showing routes taken, contacts made with U-boats, attacks that occurred, and casualties sustained. The prisoner advisory group would analyze these operations and recommend adjustments that might have reduced casualties. Recommendations would be implemented on a trial basis, and results would be shared with the group in subsequent meetings. Participants would receive better camp conditions, regular correspondence with families, and access to additional Red Cross packages. Hartmann asked about security. "How will you prevent information about this advisory group from reaching Germany? If word gets out that we're cooperating with British intelligence, it could endanger our families." Morrison responded to this question directly. "All participants will be listed in camp records as working on administrative duty. No specific information about the advisory group will be documented in ways that could be captured or intercepted. Letters to families will be censored normally, with no mention of the group's activities permitted. We're taking this seriously, because we understand the risks you're accepting." 12 prisoners volunteered for the advisory group, including Hartmann and Reinhardt. Weber declined, as did about half the others who'd attended the meeting. Hartmann understood both positions. Joining the group meant crossing a line, accepting a form of cooperation that would be difficult to justify if circumstances changed. Declining meant maintaining ideological purity, but accepting that you had no influence over events that might save lives. Neither choice was clearly right or clearly wrong. The first meeting of the advisory group occurred 3 days later. Blackwood presented details of convoy HX-23-8, which had crossed the Atlantic in late October with 47 merchant ships, and an escort group of 5 destroyers and 2 corvettes. The convoy had been attacked by a wolf pack of 8 U-boats operating in the central Atlantic Gap. 3 merchant ships were sunk, totaling 18,000 tons. 1 U-boat was destroyed by depth charges. Casualties: 20 chefs or Allied merchant sailors killed, 51 German submariners killed. Blackwood spread charts on the table showing the convoy's route and the positions where attacks had occurred. The advisory group studied the information in silence, each man processing what he was seeing, and thinking through what he would have done differently if he'd been commanding one of those U-boats. Hartmann noticed something immediately. The convoy had maintained a predictable course through the central Atlantic Gap, following great circle routing that minimized distance, but also made the convoy's position easy to calculate for any U-boat commander with basic navigation skills. The escort group had been positioned in a standard screen formation that provided adequate coverage against surface attacks, but left gaps that submerged submarines could exploit during daylight approaches. "What strikes you about this operation?" Blackwood asked. Hartmann pointed to the chart. "The routing is too predictable. You're following standard Great Circle navigation, which means any competent U-boat commander can calculate your approximate position days in advance, and position his boat accordingly. If you'd routed this convoy 200 miles further north, adding maybe 18 hours to the voyage time, you would have missed this wolf pack entirely." Another prisoner, a former executive officer named Paul Schneider, pointed to the escort formation diagram. "Your destroyer screen is optimized for night surface attacks, but 3 of the 4 sinkings occurred during daylight from submerged approaches. You need to adjust your escort patterns to account for periscope attacks, which means tighter spacing and more aggressive depth charging of any suspected contacts, even if sonar returns are uncertain." Blackwood took notes, asking clarifying questions, probing for specific details about U-boat tactics and decision-making processes. The meeting lasted 3 hours, covering every aspect of the convoy operation,
and producing 12 specific recommendations for adjustments to routing timing, escort deployment, and defensive procedure. At the end, Blackwood thanked them and said he'd present these recommendations to the Admiralty for evaluation and potential implementation. The group met again 4 days later to analyze a different convoy operation. Then again the following week, a pattern developed. Blackwood would present recent operations, the advisory group would analyze them, recommendations would be made and implemented, results would be reviewed in subsequent meetings. Over time, the recommendations became more sophisticated, as the prisoners learned to think defensively rather than offensively, applying their U-boat expertise to the problem of protecting rather than destroying merchant shipping. By December 1943, convoys that implemented the advisory group's recommendations were experiencing 30% fewer U-boat contacts and 40% fewer successful attacks compared to convoys that followed standard routing and escort procedures. Casualties were declining measurably. Blackwood shared these statistics with the group at their year-end meeting, presenting graphs and operational summaries that showed the impact of their work. 12 convoys protected, an estimated 2,800 Allied sailors alive who would otherwise have died, an estimated 400 German submariners alive who would otherwise have been killed in attacks on those convoys. The numbers were approximate, but directionally accurate. The advisory group had saved lives. Hartmann felt the weight of those numbers, 3,200 men alive, because 12 prisoners in a Scottish Highland camp had decided to cross a line and cooperate with their captors. It didn't make what they'd done feel less complicated or morally clearer, but it gave their captivity meaning beyond just waiting for the war to end. Reinhardt was quieter, processing the information differently. One evening after a meeting, he asked Hartmann if he thought Germany would ever forgive them for this. Hartmann didn't have an answer. Forgiveness assumed Germany would find out, which assumed they'd survive the war and return home, which assumed the war would end in a way that made return possible. Too many assumptions, too many variables outside their control. What he did know was that right now, in this moment, they were doing something that saved lives, and that had to count for something. The advisory group continued through the winter. January 1944 brought new challenges, as U-boats adopted new tactics in response to improved Allied defense. The advisory group analyzed these tactical shifts and recommended counter-adjustments, staying one step ahead of innovations that Blackwood's intelligence network reported from intercepted communications and captured U-boat. The cycle continued: tactics, counter-tactics, recommendations, implementations, results, analysis, new recommendations. By February 1944, the advisory group had become an integral part of British convoy defense planning. Blackwood brought senior Admiralty officers to several meetings, introducing them to the prisoner experts who were helping save lives. The officers were professional and respectful, treating the Germans as colleagues rather than enemy prisoners, acknowledging their contribution without pretending the underlying situation wasn't deeply unusual. One of these officers was Rear Admiral Sir Thomas Phillips, who commanded the Western Approaches Command responsible for convoy protection in the Atlantic. Phillips attended a meeting in March 1944, and afterward took Hartmann aside for a private conversation. "Kapitänleutnant," he said, speaking through Morrison as translator, "what you and your colleagues are doing here may be one of the most significant contributions to saving lives in this entire war. I want you to understand that your work is recognized at the highest levels of the Royal Navy, and when this war ends, there will be people who remember what you did here." Hartmann didn't know how to respond to that. Recognition from the enemy wasn't something he'd sought or wanted. He'd joined the advisory group because it seemed like the right thing to do, given the circumstances, but he hadn't thought about what that choice might mean after the war ended. Phillips seemed to understand his silence. "I know this puts you in a difficult position," he said. "You're helping us, which means you're working against your own country's interests, at least superficially, but what you're actually doing is saving lives on both sides. That's not treachery, that's humanity asserting itself even in the middle of a brutal war. When history judges this moment, I believe you'll be remembered well." Hartmann nodded slowly, accepting the words without fully believing them. History would be written by whoever won the war, and how they chose to frame the advisory group's work would depend on factors far beyond his control or understanding.
April 1944. Word about the advisory group had spread through the camp despite security measures, and the reaction was predictably hostile. Most prisoners viewed cooperation with British intelligence as collaboration and betrayal, and the 12 members of the advisory group found themselves increasingly isolated from the general prison population. Hartmann first noticed the change during meals when other prisoners would deliberately avoid sitting near him or Reinhardt, leaving empty spaces around them at the communal tables. Then came the whispered comments, just loud enough to hear, but quiet enough to deny if confronted. Traitor, collaborator, English sympathizer. Hartmann ignored most of it, understanding that the other prisoners were processing complex emotions in a situation that offered few outlets for frustration or anger. But one evening in late April, the situation escalated. Hartmann returned to his barracks after an advisory group meeting to find his footlocker open and contents scattered across his bunk. The photograph of his daughter was torn in half. Anna's letters were crumpled and thrown on the floor. Someone had written "traitor" across his pillow in what looked like boot polish. Reinhardt's belongings had received similar treatment. Hartmann stood looking at the destruction for a long moment, then began methodically collecting his belongings and restoring order. Other prisoners in the barracks watched in silence, no one offering help or expressing sympathy. When Hartmann finished, he sat on his bunk and carefully tried to repair the torn photograph using small strips of paper as tape. The tear ran through his daughter's face, a clean diagonal line that he couldn't fully hide no matter how carefully he aligned the pieces. Reinhardt entered the barracks an hour later and immediately saw what had happened. His face went pale, then flushed red with anger. He looked around at the other prisoners. Who did this? Silence. No one met his eyes. Reinhardt's hands clenched into fists. I asked who did this. More silence. Hartmann stood up and put a hand on Reinhardt's shoulder. Leave it. They're entitled to their anger. Reinhardt turned to face him. Entitled? They destroyed our personal belongings. They tore up a photograph of your daughter. That's not anger. That's cruelty. Hartmann looked at the torn photograph, the careful repair job that couldn't hide what had been done. Maybe we deserve, maybe what we're doing does make us traitors, and this is how traitors should be treated. Reinhardt pulled away. You don't believe that. I don't know what I believe anymore. All I know is that we're saving lives, and that seems more important than maintaining ideological purity or protecting our reputations, but I understand why they hate us for it. The incident was reported to Morrison, who launched an investigation that went nowhere because no one was willing to identify who'd vandalized the belongings. Morrison offered to move Hartmann and Reinhardt to separate quarters with better security, but they declined. Accepting special treatment would only confirm in the other prisoners' minds that they'd become British collaborators. 3 days later, Hartmann was working on the forestry detail when 6 prisoners approached him in the woods, far enough from the guards that the confrontation wouldn't be observed. Their leader was Weber, the U-boat commander, who'd questioned Blackwood's proposal during the initial assembly. Weber spoke quietly, his voice controlled but cold. We need to talk about what you're doing with the British. Hartmann set down his axe, noting that the 6 men had positioned themselves to surround him, blocking any easy path back toward the guards. I'm helping to save lives. You're helping the enemy destroy German U-boats. Every convoy that successfully avoids our submarines because of your advice is a failure for Germany and a victory for Britain. That's the definition of collaboration. Hartmann met Weber's eyes directly. The Battle of the Atlantic is lost. Allied ship production exceeds our sinking capacity, and new technologies are making U-boat operations unsustainable. What we're doing changes nothing strategically, but it saves thousands of lives that would otherwise be wasted in a campaign that's already failed. Weber's expression hard. You don't get to make that determination. You're not a strategic planner or political leader. You're a U-boat commander who took an oath to serve Germany, and now you're betraying that oath by helping the enemy. One of the other prisoners, a young torpedo officer Hartmann didn't recognize, stepped closer. When we return to Germany, people will remember what you did. You'll be tried as a traitor and probably executed. Your family will be shared. Your name will be remembered as someone who betrayed his country. Hartmann felt something cold settle in his chest. Are you threatening my family? Weber held up a hand. No one is threatening anyone. We're simply explaining consequence. What you're doing here will have repercussions that extend beyond this camp and beyond this war. You need to understand that. Hartmann picked up his axe, testing its weight.
making it clear he wasn't intimidated even though he was outnumbered. I understand perfect. You think collaboration with the enemy is always wrong regardless of circumstances or outcomes. I think saving lives is more important than ideological purity. We're not going to agree on this, so unless you're planning to attack me right now, this conversation is over. The 6 men didn't move immediately, tension hanging in the air like something physical. Then Weber nodded slowly and stepped back, gesturing for the others to follow. This isn't over, he said. Eventually you'll have to answer for what you're doing. Hartmann watched them walk away, then returned to work. His hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline working its way through his system. He'd expected hostility from other prisoners, but the direct confrontation and implied threats were more serious than he'd anticipated. If the situation continued to escalate, it could become dangerous. That evening, Hartmann reported the incident to Blackwood during an advisory group meeting. Blackwood listened with concern, then spoke seriously. We can provide better security if need. Separate quarters, guards assigned specifically to protect advisory group members. I don't want anyone hurt because they're helping us. Hartmann shook his head. Special treatment would only make things worse. Right now we're just prisoners who some people think are collaborating. If you start treating us differently, we become something else, and that will increase rather than decrease hostility. Blackwood wasn't satisfied but accepted the decision. Over the following weeks, the situation in the camp became increasingly tense. The advisory group continued their meetings, analyzing convoy operations and making recommendations that continued to save lives. By May 1944, their work had contributed to protecting 38 convoys and preventing an estimated 11,000 casualties among Allied and German sailors. But the cost within the camp was growing. Several members of the advisory group were assaulted by other prisoners. Minor incidents involving shoves and thrown food. Nothing serious enough to require medical attention, but clear signals of escalating hostility. Morrison cracked down with restrictions and punishments for any prisoner caught engaging in violence, but the underlying tension remained. Reinhardt suggested they should quit the advisory group, step back before the situation deteriorated further. Hartmann considered it seriously, weighing the risks against the benefits, trying to calculate whether their personal safety was worth the lives they were saving through their cooperation with Blackwood. One evening, a letter arrived from Anne. It had been 3 months since her last correspondence, and Hartmann opened it with hands that trembled slightly. The letter was brief, just 1 page, and the news was devastating. Their daughter had been killed in an air raid on Bremen in March. British bombers targeting the shipyard. A bomb had hit their building directly. Their daughter had died instantly. Anna had survived with minor injuries, and had been relocated to her sister's home in the countryside. The letter was clinical and factual, no emotion or commentary, just information delivered in Anna's careful handwriting. Hartmann read it 3 times sitting on his bunk in the barracks, surrounded by prisoners who wouldn't speak to him. He tried to process what the words meant, tried to connect the information to some emotional response, but he felt nothing, just a kind of hollow emptiness that spread through his chest and made breathing difficult. He thought about the advisory group and the 11,000 lives they'd saved. He thought about his daughter's life, ended by British bombs, while he sat in a British prisoner of war camp, helping British intelligence protect British shipping. The irony was so brutal it transcended irony and became something else, some kind of cosmic joke that he couldn't comprehend. Reinhardt found him later that evening, still sitting on his bunk with Anna's letter in his hands. Reinhardt read the letter without being asked, then sat down beside Hartmann and said nothing. There were no words that would make this better or meaningful or acceptable. After a long silence, Hartmann spoke quietly. I need to tell Blackwood I'm leaving the advisory group. Reinhardt nodded. I'll come with you. They're killing our families while we help them win the war. This has to stop. Hartmann folded the letter carefully, and put it in his footlocker with the torn photograph of his daughter. He stared at the photograph for a long time, the careful repair work he'd done, the diagonal tear running through her face. Then he closed the footlocker and lay down on his bunk. The next morning, Hartmann and Reinhardt went to Morrison's office and requested a meeting with Blackwood. Morrison arranged it for that afternoon, and when Blackwood arrived, Hartmann explained the situation simply and direct. My daughter was killed by British bombs while I was helping you protect British shipping. I can't continue with the advisory group. Reinhardt is leaving as well. Blackwood's face showed genuine distress. Kapitänleutnant, I'm so sorry. I know nothing I can say will make this bearable, but please know that your daughter's death is a tragedy that no one in this room wanted or caused. The war is killing innocents on all sides, and that's precisely why the work you've been doing matters. Every life saved through the advisory group's recommendations is a life that doesn't become another casualty statistic. Hartmann stood up to leave. I understand your perspective, but I can't keep doing this. Not now, not after this. Blackwood didn't try to stop him, just nodded slowly and watched as Hartmann and Reinhardt left the office. They returned to their barracks and resumed normal camp routines, work details and meals and evening free time, trying to blend back into the general prisoner population as if the past 6 months hadn't happened. The other prisoners noticed the change immediate. Word spread through the camp that Hartmann and Reinhardt had quit the advisory group, and the hostility that had been building for months began to fade. Men who wouldn't speak to them started offering brief greetings. Tables at meals weren't automatically empty around them anymore. Small gestures of acceptance that indicated they were being welcomed back into the community they'd temporarily left. Webber approached Hartmann one afternoon during work detail. I heard about your daughter. I'm sorry, that shouldn't have happened to anyone's family. Hartmann nodded, accepting the condolence without responding verbally. Webber continued, I was too hard on you before. What you were doing with the advisory group was wrong, but I understand why you did it. Trying to save lives isn't the worst motivation, even if the execution was misguided. Hartmann finally spoke. Did we save lives or just extend a war that's already lost? I don't know anymore. I thought I was doing the right thing, but maybe I was just rationalizing collaboration because it made captivity feel meaningful. Webber didn't have an answer for that, and the two men returned to work in silence. The advisory group continued without Hartmann and Reinhardt, the remaining members carrying on with the work. Blackwood asked twice if Hartmann would reconsider, but Hartmann declined both times. He couldn't separate the work from his daughter's death, couldn't look at convoy routes and casualty statistics without thinking about British bombers over Bremen and the cosmic injustice of saving enemy lives while his own family was being destroyed. May turned into June. D-Day occurred, Allied forces landing in Normandy and beginning the liberation of Western Europe. News filtered into the camp through guards and Red Cross representatives, rumors and confirmed reports mixing together into a narrative of German defeat that became harder to deny with each passing week. The prisoners processed this information in different ways. Some remained defiant, insisting Germany would still find a way to win. Others became depressed and withdrawn, accepting that the war was lost and they were just waiting for the inevitable conclusion. A few, like Hartmann, felt nothing much at all, existing in a kind of emotional limbo where news from the outside world seemed distant and unreal. In July, another letter arrived from Anna. She was still living with her sister in the countryside, working in a factory that produced uniforms for the Wehrmacht. She asked about Hartmann's health and whether he was being treated well in the camp. She didn't mention their daughter or the air raid or anything that had happened in March. The letter was brief and factual, as if writing about normal topics was the only way she could maintain composure. Hartmann wrote back with similar restraint, describing the camp and his daily routine without mentioning the advisory group or his decision to quit or any of the moral complications that had defined the past year. They were two people trying to maintain connection across distance and tragedy through letters that carefully avoided everything that actually mattered.
August 1944. Blackwood requested one final meeting with Hartmann. Morrison delivered the message personally, emphasizing that Hartmann was under no obligation to attend, but that Blackwood had something important to discuss. Hartmann agreed, curious despite himself. They met in Morrison's office on a grey afternoon when rain was falling steadily outside, turning the campgrounds into mud and making the barracks feel even more confined than usual. Blackwood stood when Hartmann entered, gesturing to a chair, and waited until they were both seated before speaking. Kapitänleutnant, I'm not here to ask you to rejoin the advisory group. I understand why you can't do that, and I respect your decision, but I wanted to share something with you because I think you deserve to know what your work accomplished. He pulled out a document folder and spread several pages across Morrison's desk. These are casualty statistics for Atlantic convoy operations, comparing periods before and after the advisory group's recommendations were implemented. The data is clear and undeniable. From December 1943 through July 1944, convoys that followed your recommendations experienced a 62% reduction in successful U-boat attacks and a 71% reduction in casualties, compared to convoys that used standard routing and defense procedures. Hartmann looked at the numbers without touching the papers. What does that mean in actual lives? Blackwood met his eyes directly. Conservative estimate 4,200 Allied sailors alive who would otherwise have died. Approximately 800 German submariners alive who would otherwise have been killed in attacks on those convoys. Total of 5,000 lives saved because 12 prisoners decided to share their knowledge with us. Hartmann felt something twist in his chest. 5,000 lives. That was more than the population of some towns, more people than he'd ever meet in a lifetime. And somewhere in those statistics, his daughter's death was also recorded, one casualty among millions. A life ended while he worked to save others. The arithmetic was impossible to reconcile. Does it change anything? Hartmann asked quietly. These people are alive instead of dead, but the war continues. More people die every day. Eventually we'll reach some final number that represents total casualties, and my daughter will still be part of that count regardless of how many others we manage to save. Blackwood was silent for a moment, choosing his words carefully. You're right that one life can't be balanced against another, and your daughter's death is a tragedy that can't be undone or compensated for. But I believe that saving 5,000 lives matters, even in the context of a war that's killed millions. Those 5,000 people have families, futures, potential contributions to make to the world. They're alive because you and your colleagues decided that saving lives was more important than ideological consistency. That has to mean something. Hartmann stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rain falling on the campgrounds, prisoners moving between buildings, hunched against the weather, trying to stay dry. Guards in their towers, rifles slung over shoulders, watching nothing in particular because escape attempts were rare and mostly pointless. The whole scene felt unreal, a stage set for a play about war and captivity and moral compromise. I keep thinking about the men from the city of Benares, he said, 42 sailors freezing in the North Atlantic while I watched through a periscope. I could have surfaced and tried to rescue them, but I didn't because my orders were to avoid unnecessary risks and maximize operational effectiveness. Those 42 men died because I followed my training and did my duty. Were they any less valuable than the 5,000 we saved? Blackwood joined him at the window. No, they weren't less valuable, but you made decisions based on the information and circumstances you had at the time. Now you have different information and different circumstances, and you're making different decisions. That's not hypocrisy or betrayal. That's learning and adapting based on experience. Hartmann turned away from the window. What do you want from me, Commander? If you're not asking me to rejoin the advisory group, what's the purpose of this meeting? Blackwood returned to the desk and pulled out another document, this one marked with official seals and signatures. The Admiralty wants to recognize the advisory group's contribution formally. They're preparing commendations that will be placed in each participant's file, documenting their cooperation and the lives saved as a result. When the war ends and prisoners are repatriated, these commendations may provide some protection if questions are raised about collaboration. I wanted to make sure you and Riesenart are included, even though you left the group early. Your initial contribution was significant, and you deserve recognition for that. Hartmann felt cold anger rise in his chest. Recognition from the British Admiralty for helping them kill my countrymen while they killed my family. How is that supposed to help anything? Blackwood's expression remained calm but firm. I understand your anger, but practical reality is this. When Germany loses this war, and it will lose, there will be chaos and recriminations, and people looking for scapegoats. Having official documentation that you cooperated with Allied forces in a humanitarian capacity might be the difference between being treated as a prisoner of war, who made difficult choices, or being treated as a traitor subject to execution. I'm trying to protect you and your colleagues from what comes next. Hartmann sat back down, the anger draining away as quickly as it had appeared, leaving just exhaustion. Do what you think is necessary. I don't care anymore about recognition or protection or any of it. I just want this war to end so I can go home to whatever's left of my life. Blackwood nodded and put the commendation document back in his folder. There's one more thing.
The advisory group is preparing a final report summarizing all their recommendations and the results achieved. They want to include testimonials from each participant, explaining why they chose to cooperate and what they hope the work accomplished. Would you be willing to contribute something? Hartmann almost refused automatically, but something made him pause. A testimonial meant putting into words why he'd crossed the line from prisoner to collaborator, trying to articulate reasons that he wasn't sure he understood himself. But maybe there was value in attempting that articulation, in trying to make sense of decisions that felt increasingly senseless as time passed and consequences accumulated. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Blackwood stood and offered his hand. Hartmann hesitated, then shook it briefly. They were still enemies, still on opposite sides of a war that had killed millions and destroyed countless lives. But they were also two men who'd worked together to save 5,000 people from drowning in the Atlantic, and that created a connection that transcended simple categorizations of ally or enemy. Hartmann returned to his barracks and found Riesenart sitting on his bunk, reading a letter from his own family in Hamburg. Riesenart looked up when Hartmann entered. "Blackwood asked you to rejoin the advisory group." "No. He wants us to write testimonials about why we cooperate." Riesenart set down his letter. "Are you going to do it?" "I don't know. Maybe. It might help make sense of everything that happened. Or it might just be another form of collaboration, justifying what we did to make ourselves feel better." Riesenart thought about that for a moment. "Does it matter anymore? The work is done. The lives are saved. Whether we write testimonials or not doesn't change what happened." Hartmann lay down on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. That night, he tried to sleep but couldn't. His mind kept circling back to the same question. Had they done the right thing by joining the advisory group? Did saving 5,000 lives justify cooperating with the enemy? Would Germany see them as humanitarians or traitors? When the war ended, would it matter what anyone thought? Or would history simply record them as casualties of a war that made everyone complicit in atrocities regardless of their intentions? He didn't have answers, but at some point during the night, he decided he would write the testimony, not because it would change anything or make sense of the moral complications, but because the 5,000 people who were alive because of the advisory group's work deserved to have their survival acknowledged and explained, even if the explanation was incomplete and unsatisfying. Over the next week, Hartmann worked on the testimonial in the evenings, writing and revising, trying to find words that captured why 12 prisoners had decided to help their captors protect ships and sailors. The writing was difficult, each sentence feeling inadequate, or overly defensive, or too clinical, but he persisted, because this felt like the only way to honor both the lives saved and the moral complexity of how they'd been saved. The final testimonial was 3 pages long, handwritten on paper. Morrison provided. Hartmann read it one final time before delivering it to Blackwood. In March 1943, my submarine U-51-7 was captured after 18 months of operations in the Atlantic. During that time, I sank 34 merchant vessels and was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Allied sailors. I followed my orders, executed my missions, and believed I was serving Germany honorably. In October 1943, I was asked to join an advisory group working with British naval intelligence to develop defensive strategies for protecting Atlantic convoys. I agreed to participate not because I stopped believing in Germany or wanted to help the enemy win the war, but because I concluded that saving lives was more important than maintaining ideological purity while thousands of men drowned in the Atlantic every month. The work we did saved approximately 5,000 lives, both Allied and German. That number is approximate, but conservative. Every person who survived because of our recommendations is someone's husband, father, son or brother who returned home instead of dying at sea. I don't know if what we did was right according to military law or German national interests. What I know is that 5,000 families did not receive telegrams informing them their loved ones were lost at sea. In war, where every decision involves moral compromise and every action has consequences that ripple beyond immediate circumstances, that seems like an outcome worth achieving. My daughter was killed by British bombs in March 1944 while I was working with the advisory group. That fact complicates everything I've written here, and makes me question whether any lives saved justify the collaboration we engaged in. But I believe my daughter would have wanted people to live, rather than die, and that belief guides how I evaluate our choice. If Germany considers this testimony evidence of treason, I accept that judgment and whatever consequences follow. If history judges us as collaborators who betrayed our country, I accept that judgment as well. What I cannot accept is the idea that we should have remained silent while possessing knowledge that could have prevented thousands of deaths, choosing ideological consistency over human lives. Hartmann signed the testimonial and gave it to Blackwood, who read it carefully and then thanked him. The testimonial was included in the advisory group's final report, which was submitted to the Admiralty in September 1944 and classified as confidential, not to be released without authorization from senior military officials. The work was finished. The advisory group disbanded. The 12 participants returned to normal camp routines, and the rest of the prisoners gradually reintegrated them into the community, tensions fading as everyone focused on surviving until the war ended, and they could return to whatever remained of their lives.
Winter 1944 into spring 1945. The camp existed in a strange limbo as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion. News from the fronts filtered in through guards and Red Cross representatives, each update confirming what most prisoners had already accepted. Germany was losing comprehensively on all fronts: the Soviet advance from the east, Allied progress through France and into Germany itself, air raids that had reduced German cities to rubble, industrial production collapsing, supply lines severed, armies surrendering by entire divisions. Hartmann processed this information with a kind of detached acceptance. He'd stopped thinking about victory or defeat in strategic terms, focusing instead on the immediate questions: would he survive to see the war's end? Would Anna survive? Would there be anything left of Germany to return to when prisoners were finally repatriated? The camp population swelled as more prisoners arrived, captured soldiers from the Western Front joining the submariners and airmen who'd been held for months or years. The new prisoners brought stories of the war's final stages: cities destroyed, civilians starving, Nazi officials fleeing or killing themselves, the entire machinery of the Third Reich collapsing under the weight of military defeat and internal disintegration. Some of the long-time prisoners refused to believe these reports, insisting they were Allied propaganda designed to break morale. Others accepted them grimly and began planning for whatever came next. Hartmann fell into the latter category, pragmatic enough to recognize that Germany had lost and idealistic enough to hope that some form of normal life might be possible once the war ended and prisoners were allowed to return home. In March 1945, Blackwood visited the camp one final time. He met with the former advisory group members, now scattered among the general prisoner population, but still identifiable as the men who'd cooperated with British intelligence. Blackwood's news was both good and tit. The war would end soon, probably within months. When it did, prisoners would be processed for repatriation, but the timeline was uncertain and would depend on negotiations between Allied powers and whatever remained of German governmental authority. The advisory group members would receive their commendations as promised, and Blackwood would personally ensure that their cooperation was documented in ways that might provide protection during repatriation and whatever came after. Hartmann listened to this with mixed feelings. Protection from what? From German authorities who might view cooperation as treason, from Allied authorities who might want to prosecute U-boat commanders for war crimes, from the chaos and disorder that would inevitably follow Germany's total defeat. Blackwood couldn't answer those questions with certainty, which told Hartmann everything he needed to know about what to expect. April brought news of Hitler's death and Germany's unconditional surrender. The camp received the information on May 8, 1945, when Colonel Morrison assembled all prisoners in the main assembly area and announced that the war in Europe had ended. Germany had surrendered. The Third Reich no longer existed. Prisoners of war would be processed for repatriation according to protocols being established by the Allied Control Council. The reaction among prisoners varied dramatically. Some collapsed in relief that the fighting was finally over. Others wept openly, mourning Germany's defeat and everything that had been lost. A few remained defiant, insisting that Germany would rise again, and that this surrender was temporary. Most just stood in silence, processing the news and trying to understand what it meant for their future. Hartmann felt nothing much at all, just a kind of hollow exhaustion that came from years of emotional compression. The war was over, he'd survived, Anna had survived, their daughter was dead, Germany was defeated, U-517 was at the bottom of the Atlantic. 5,000 people were alive because of the advisory group's work. The arithmetic of it all seemed meaningless, numbers that didn't add up to anything coherent or satisfying. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, the camp administration began processing prisoners for repatriation. The process was slow and bureaucratic, involving medical examinations, identification, verification, documentation of camp behavior, and cooperation, and assignment to repatriation groups based on home locations and administrative priorities. Hartmann's processing occurred in mid-June. He sat across from a British Army captain who reviewed his file and asked standard questions about his health, his family situation, and his plans for returning to civilian life. The captain made notes on a form, then looked up and spoke carefully. "There's a notation in your file about participation in an advisory group that assisted with convoy protection operations. That cooperation will be documented in your repatriation papers and may be relevant if questions arise about your conduct during captivity. Do you understand what that means?" Hartmann understood perfectly. It meant that anyone reviewing his repatriation papers would see that he'd cooperated with British intelligence, and they could interpret that cooperation however they chose, as humanitarian work that saved lives, or as collaboration that betrayed Germany. The ambiguity was intentional, giving future authorities flexibility in how they treated him. "I understand," Hartmann said. The captain finished his forms and passed them across for signature. Hartmann signed without reading them carefully, accepting whatever was written because he had no real choice in the matter. Reinhardt's processing occurred the same day, and afterward they sat together in the barracks discussing what came next. Repatriation would take weeks or months, depending on transportation availability and administrative process. When they finally returned to Germany, they'd be entering a country that no longer existed in the form they'd known, occupied by Allied forces and being divided into zones of control that would eventually become separate nations. The Germany they'd fought for was gone. What remained was uncertain, and potentially dangerous for anyone associated with the Nazi regime or the military establishment that had prosecuted the war. "Should we be worried?" Reinhardt asked, "about what happens when we get back?" Hartmann thought about it seriously before answering. "I think we should be cautious and prepared for questions, but I don't think we're in immediate danger. We're not war criminals. We followed orders and conducted military operations according to accepted rules of warfare. The advisory group work complicates things, but we have documentation from British authorities explaining that it was humanitarian cooperation aimed at saving lives. That should provide some protection." Reinhardt didn't look convinced. "And if it does, if some prosecutor decides we're traitors and wants to make an example of us, then we deal with it when it happens. Right now, all we can do is go home and try to rebuild our lives and hope that the chaos of Germany's defeat provides enough cover that no one pays attention to 12 U-boat officers who spent the last year of the war in a Scottish prison camp. They were repatriated in August 1945, part of a group of 200 prisoners transported by train to a port in southern England, then by ship across the Channel to a processing center in the American occupation zone of Germany. The journey took 4 days, and Hartmann spent most of it standing on deck watching the ocean pass by, thinking about U-517 and all the ships he'd sunk and the men who'd died in these same waters while he'd watched through a periscope. The processing center in Germany was chaotic and overwhelmed, thousands of returning prisoners being documented and cleared for release into a country that was still struggling to establish basic services and infrastructure after total defeat. Hartmann and Reinhardt were processed in separate lines, received travel documents and minimal rations, and were directed to report to their local administrative offices when they reached their home cities for additional processing and potential work assignments. Hartmann's travel to Bremen took 3 days by a combination of military transport trucks and walking, navigating through a landscape that looked like something from an apocalypse. Cities reduced to rubble, bridges destroyed, roads cratered by bombs, refugees moving in long columns carrying whatever possessions they'd managed to save, displaced persons camps housing thousands of people who no longer had homes to return to. The scale of destruction was beyond anything Hartmann had imagined, even after hearing reports from prisoners who'd been captured on the Western Front. Germany hadn't just lost the war, it had been annihilated as a functional nation,
Bremen was barely recognizable. The shipyards where U-517 had been built were flattened, the city center was gone, just piles of rubble and a few partially standing buildings. The apartment building where Hartmann had lived with Anna and their daughter had taken a direct hit and was now just a foundation with debris scattered across it. Hartmann stood looking at the ruins for a long time, trying to remember what the building had looked like before the war, trying to connect those memories to the present reality. He could. The past felt like something that had happened to someone else, a story he'd heard but hadn't actually experienced. Anna was living with her sister in a small town 40 kilometers from Bremen, and Hartmann made his way there on foot, carrying his small pack of belongings and his repatriation papers. The walk took most of a day, and he arrived in the evening, exhausted and covered in road dust. Anna opened the door and looked at him for a long moment, as if verifying that he was real and actually standing in front of her. Then she stepped forward and they embraced, holding each other without speaking. Two people who'd been separated by 3 years of war and tragedy and loss, trying to find some connection to who they'd been before everything fell apart. That night, sitting in Anna's sister's kitchen, Hartmann told her about the prison camp and the advisory group and the testimonial he'd written. Anna listened without interrupting, her face expressionless, processing information that must have seemed surreal given everything she'd experienced during the same period. When he finished, she asked a single question: "Do you think you did the right thing?" Hartmann didn't have a clear answer, even after months of thinking about it. "I think I did the best I could with the information and circumstances I had. Whether that was right or wrong depends on how you evaluate the outcomes, and what principles you think should guide behavior in impossible situations." Anna nodded slowly. "I'm glad you survived. That's all that matters to me. Everything else is just detail."
September 1945. Hartmann reported to the Bremen Administrative Office as instructed in his repatriation documents. The office was located in one of the few undamaged buildings in the city, a former bank that had been converted into a processing center for returning military personnel. He waited 3 hours in a crowded hallway filled with other veterans, all of them trying to reintegrate into a country that had been fundamentally transformed by defeat. When his name was called, Hartmann entered a small office where an American military officer and a German civilian administrator reviewed his papers. The American officer, a major named Richardson, spoke through a translator, asking standard questions about Hartmann's military service, his time in the prison camp, and his participation in the advisory group. Richardson's questions were professional and neutral, not hostile but not friendly either, just fact-gathering to complete required documentation. The German administrator was less neutral. His name was Miller, and he looked at Hartmann with barely concealed contempt when the advisory group participation came up. "You cooperated with enemy intelligence while Germany was fighting for survival." Hartmann met his gaze directly. "I provided information that saved lives on both sides. The war was already lost when the advisory group began its work. What we did changed nothing strategically but prevented thousands of unnecessary deaths." Miller made notes on a form that will be investigated by German authorities when civilian governance is fully restored. "For now, you're cleared for provisional release, but you should expect to be called for additional interviews as more information becomes available about collaboration activities in prisoner of war camps." Richardson intervened, speaking through the translator. "The advisory group's activities have been reviewed by Allied military authorities and determined to be humanitarian cooperation consistent with Geneva Convention provisions for prisoner of war conduct. There's no evidence of collaboration that would warrant prosecution under military law." Miller clearly disagreed, but couldn't override the American officer's assessment. He finished his documentation and passed Hartmann's papers across the desk. "Report here monthly for status update. If you change your address or leave the American occupation zone, you must notify this office within 48 hours. Failure to comply will result in arrest." Hartmann took his papers and left, understanding that Miller represented a faction in post-war Germany that viewed any cooperation with Allied forces as betrayal regardless of circumstances or outcomes. That faction might gain influence as Germany rebuilt and established new governance structures, or it might be marginalized by pragmatists who recognized that survival required adapting to new realities. Either outcome was possible, and Hartmann had no control over which direction things would go. Over the following months, Hartmann tried to rebuild a life in the ruins of Germany, Work was scarce and mostly involved physical labor clearing rubble and reconstructing basic infrastructure. He found employment with a crew working to restore rail lines, spending 10 hours a day digging and hauling and laying new track across landscape that had been bombed and shelled into something barely recognizable as the country he'd grown up in. The pay was minimal, paid in a combination of occupation currency and food rations, but it was enough to contribute to Anna's sister's household expenses and maintain some sense of purpose. Anna was working in a factory that produced textiles, part of the gradual industrial reconstruction that the occupation authorities were encouraging to prevent complete economic collapse. They lived with her sister and her sister's family in a crowded 2-bedroom house, 4 adults and 2 children sharing space that had been designed for half that many people. Privacy was impossible, and the constant proximity created friction and tension that everyone managed through careful politeness and avoiding difficult topics. Hartmann rarely talked about the war or the prison camp or the advisory group. The few times he tried, Anna's sister's husband had made it clear that such topics weren't welcome, implying that anyone who'd cooperated with the British was suspect and potentially dangerous to associate with. So Hartmann kept his experiences to himself, carrying them silently while trying to navigate a world that seemed determined to forget the war as quickly as possible, while simultaneously remaining trapped by its consequences. In November 1945, Hartmann received a letter from Reinhardt, who'd returned to Hamburg and was experiencing similar difficulties, reintegrating into civilian life. Reinhardt's letter described harassment from neighbors who'd learned about the advisory group, anonymous threats left on his doorstep, being refused service at local shops because people considered him a collaborator. Reinhardt was considering emigrating maybe to South America or Canada, anywhere he could start fresh without the weight of suspicion and accusation following him. Hartmann understood the impulse but didn't think emigration was realistic, given the restrictions on travel and the complexity of obtaining visas and permission to leave the occupation zone. They were trapped in Germany at least for the foreseeable future, and would have to find ways to live with whatever judgments people chose to make about their wartime conduct. December brought unexpected news. Commander Blackwood appeared at the Bremen administrative office, requesting a meeting with Hartmann. They met in a private room, and Blackwood explained that he was in Germany as part of a British military delegation assessing conditions in the occupation zone. He'd made a point of looking up former advisory group members to see how they were managing and to offer assistance if needed. "How are you doing?" Blackwood asked directly. Hartmann considered how to answer honestly. "I'm surviving, working, staying out of trouble, trying to rebuild a life. But there's suspicion and hostility from people who know about the advisory group, and I don't see that changing anytime soon." Blackwood nodded sympathetically. "I've heard similar reports from others. It's unfortunate that humanitarian cooperation is being interpreted as collaboration, but I suppose it's inevitable given how the war ended, and how desperately Germany is trying to process its defeat." He pulled out a document from his briefcase. "I wanted to give you this personal. It's an official commendation from the Royal Navy, acknowledging your contribution to saving lives during the Atlantic campaign. It includes specific statistics about convoy operations and casualties prevented, and it's signed by senior Admiralty officials. I think it might help if questions continue to arise about your conduct." Hartmann accepted the document and read it carefully. The language was formal and complimentary, describing the advisory group's work as an extraordinary example of humanitarian cooperation that transcended national interests and saved thousands of lives. The statistics were there: 5,000 casualties prevented, 42 convoys protected, 62% reduction in successful U-boat attacks for convoys following advisory group recommendation. It was impressive documentation, but Hartmann wasn't sure how much protection it would provide if German authorities decided to pursue collaboration charges. "Will this make a difference?" he asked. Blackwood didn't make promises he couldn't keep. "I don't know, but it's official recognition from the British government that what you did was valuable and appropriate. That should carry some weight with Allied occupation authorities, and it might influence German authorities when civilian governance is restored. At minimum, it's evidence that you acted with good intentions and achieved meaningful results." They talked for another hour, Blackwood sharing news about other advisory group members and the post-war restructuring of naval operations. Several of the group had emigrated successfully, finding sponsors in Britain or the United States who'd arranged visas and employment based on their cooperation during the war. Others,
like Hartmann, were trying to rebuild lives in Germany, despite the complications that cooperation had created. When Blackwood left, he shook Hartmann's hand and said something that stayed with Hartmann for years afterward. "You saved 5,000 lives when you had every reason to do nothing. History will remember that kindly, even if the present does." Hartmann returned home with the commendation and showed it to Anna. She read it carefully, then folded it and put it in a drawer where they kept important documents. "We should keep this somewhere safe," she said. "It might become important later." The rest of 1945 and into 1946 passed in a rhythm of work and survival. Hartmann continued his labor on the rail reconstruction project, advancing to a supervisory role that paid slightly better and was less physically demanding. Anna continued working at the textile factory, and they began saving money toward renting their own apartment once housing became available. Life stabilized into something that resembled normalcy, though the shadow of the war remained present in everything they did and every choice they made. In March 1946, Hartmann was called back to the administrative office for what Miller described as a follow-up interview. This time there were 2 additional men present, a German prosecutor and an investigator, from what remained of the German judicial system. They questioned Hartmann extensively about the advisory group, asking for specific details about what information he'd provided to British intelligence and what outcomes had resulted from that cooperation. Hartmann answered truthfully, providing the same information he'd included in his testimonial and showing them the British commendation that documented the group's work. The prosecutor was skeptical, suggesting that the commendation was propaganda designed to protect collaborators from prosecution. The investigator was more measured, acknowledging that the situation was complicated and that moral judgments were difficult to make about wartime conduct when circumstances were extreme and choices were limited. The interview lasted 4 hours and ended without resolution. Hartmann was told he'd be notified if formal charges were filed, but the timeline was uncertain given the chaotic state of German governance and the competing jurisdictions between Allied occupation authorities and emerging German civilian authorities. Hartmann left the office exhausted and anxious, uncertain whether he'd be arrested or cleared, or left in perpetual limbo waiting for someone to make a decision about his fate. That uncertainty continued through the spring and summer of 1945. Hartmann reported monthly to the administrative office as required, and each time he expected to be arrested or charged with collaboration, but nothing happened. The prosecutor apparently had more pressing cases to pursue, and the investigator's report presumably concluded that the evidence didn't warrant prosecution. Or maybe the whole matter was simply forgotten in the larger chaos of post-war reconstruction and competing priorities. In September 1946, Hartmann received a letter from the administrative office officially closing his case. The letter stated that his participation in the advisory group had been reviewed by appropriate authorities and determined to be consistent with acceptable conduct for prisoners of war. Under Geneva Convention provisions, no charges would be filed. His status was cleared for full reintegration into civilian life without restrictions. Hartmann read the letter 3 times, hardly believing what it said. After a year of anxiety and suspicion and waiting for consequences, he was being told that everything was fine, that his cooperation had been officially sanctioned as appropriate, that he could move forward without the threat of prosecution hanging over his future. Anna cried when he showed her the letter, relief breaking through the careful emotional control she'd maintained throughout the uncertainty. They celebrated quietly that evening, sharing a bottle of wine that Anna's sister had been saving for a special occasion, allowing themselves to feel something like hope for the first time since the war ended.